We now return to The Real Story. Here's your host, Jeannie Ives.
Hello, welcome to The Real Story with Jeannie Ives. The phone number here is 312-642-5600 if you want to weigh in on the discussion. And we're turning to something that is near and dear to my heart, and that is military readiness, and more importantly, wokeness in the military. Hello, it has created a lot of problems. And, let's just look at this right now. According to military.com, in an article dated June 2024, since 2013, male enlistments have dropped 35%, going from 58,000 men enlisting in 2013 to 37,700 in 2023, according to service data. Meanwhile, female recruitment has hovered around 10,000 recruits each year. From Task and Purpose, the women who wear the crowns of the two premier U.S. beauty pageants are now both active duty service members, after Army Second Lieutenant Alma Cooper, a West Point graduate and intelligence officer, was crowned Miss USA on Sunday. This was a previous article, obviously. Cooper's title comes 8 months into the reign of Air Force Second Lieutenant Madison Marsh. She is now Miss America. So Miss USA, Miss America, both of them graduated from service academies in 2023. Guess what they're not doing? They're not serving in uniform like they should be. Then we've got this issue with the military, and this comes from notes that Brent Ramsey gave me. Brent was on my program prior to this a few months ago. He's a graduate of the University of Nebraska, NROTC. He had a Navy career that spanned 40 years and, did everything that he possibly could with that you can imagine. But he wrote that in the FY 2025 budget proposed by Biden reflects a cut of 1% in the Navy's budget due to inflation. This while threats multiply around the world from the CCP, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and radical Islam. The budget will be the smallest in modern history at 2.9% of GDP. When Reagan was president, the military budget was 6% of GDP. And that's when we used to argue over guns versus butter. No longer. And right now, the interest on the debt is higher than the defense budget. Here's another thing concerning the Navy selected 7 Ticonderoga-class cruisers for repair and upgrade. After 5 years, 4 of the ships had to be retired. They were in such bad condition. The Navy spent $2.8 billion with nothing to show for it. 3 of the cruisers are still being worked on with no date on when they'll return. Something close to my heart from aviationpros.com. The military's nearly 400 V-22 Ospreys will not be permitted to fly their full range of missions until mid-2025. The leader of the aircraft program told House lawmakers on Wednesday, I will not certify the V-22 to return to unrestricted flight operations until I'm satisfied we have sufficiently addressed the issues that may affect safety of the aircraft. Of course, this is because on November 29th, Osprey went down, killing 8 service members. That crash was the 4th in 2 years, killing 20 troops in total. Well, here to discuss what the hell's going on in the military is Guy Higgins. Guy Higgins is a retired Navy captain. He was a Naval Academy graduate. He served 30 years on active duty with 5 deployments and more than 4,000 flight hours. He worked for Boeing for 12 years as a VP before running his own small consulting business for 7 years. He joins us to discuss the status of the military and more specifically the Navy and a new book that he is one of the authors of, and that is Don't Give Up the Ship. Woke Politics Are Endangering Our Military and Our Nation. The book can be pre-ordered on Amazon with a publication date of September 17th. Captain Higgins, thank you so much for joining me on The Real Story.
Well, Jean, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about what is going on in the military. And you captured it excellently in your lead-in. The recruiting is down, retention is down. The Navy just announced that the Chief of Naval Operations is the final approval authority for sidelining 17 ships because of manning constraints. 17 ships. We're in a world that is increasingly dangerous, and here we're talking about sidelining ships, and some of those are the very ships that we need to be responsive in a global mission. It's terrible.
It's absolutely terrible. And I suppose people like to pass this off as, it's an issue with Congress. We're not getting the funding. Whatever other issue, at the core of it, it's a problem with officership, in my opinion. And please tell me if you think that I'm wrong. But I think that we do not have the type of commanders at the very top level that we need to have to stand up and make statements about what's going on with the military. This is a very dangerous situation. We are really low on the number of ships that we need to have overall. It's a glaring problem.
I think that it is a problem of leadership, and it's a very complicated problem. I'll tell you a story. In 1942, the commanding officer of every U.S. submarine in the Pacific at the start of the year had been relieved before the end of the year for insufficient aggressiveness. And the issue was that those commanding officers in January 1st of 1942 were peacetime commanding officers. All of a sudden, they weren't peacetime commanding officers anymore. They were wartime commanding officers, and they didn't make the adjustment. We're in a situation now where we're not going to be able to afford to do things like that. Even though we have been deeply involved in countering insurgencies and terrorists, that there is stress and distress and tension throughout the world, we have largely still been a peacetime Navy. We've not been directly engaged in most cases. And so we have a peacetime mentality, and people get promoted for administrative excellence and being able to make their numbers. As you said, I worked for Boeing for 12 years, and making the numbers was important. And making the numbers is important in the Navy, too, but only if they're the right numbers. And those right numbers need to be focused not necessarily on the administrative aspects of it, but how good the crews are, how good the commanding officers are, how good the officer cadre on a ship is. That's really important information. Those are really important things. And one of the things we're dealing with is political pressure to achieve some kind of a, quote, demographic balance. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with having a ship's crew, ship's officers that come from all sorts of demographic backgrounds, assuming that we chose the right people, the best people for those jobs. Our sailors, our Marines, our airmen, our soldiers deserve the very best leadership that we as a country can provide them. They're putting their lives on the line. They deserve to have the very best leaders we can. We cannot afford to choose leaders for political reasons. If you go back a couple of hundred years, the British Empire frequently picked Army and naval officers based on social status or whether or not they could buy a commission. That was not real good for them. They suffered some tremendous setbacks. They maintained their empire up into the mid-20th century, but still, that was not a good way to go forward, and they suffered for it. We similarly cannot afford to risk choosing officers who are not the best that we can provide as a nation. And when we start saying, well, it's important that we have 13% African-American officers, okay, would somebody explain to me why that is? And I've heard that, well, it's important for the troops to have role models with whom they can identify. Now, 30 years in the Navy, working with a lot of sailors of all different kinds, and I'll tell you what, those sailors are smart. They're really smart, and what they're looking for is somebody who's a good leader. That's the first person they're going to identify with. They don't care what the person's skin color is or what their religion is or what their ethnic background is. They care whether or not that person is going to take care of me and give me good orders and get the mission accomplished. That's what they care about. And that's important. That's the reason that there is a Navy. That's the reason there is an Army.
Yeah, there's no other place where it's more important to have meritocracy than I would say in the armed forces, is because lives are literally at risk with every single mission. And it could be a training mission. As I just noted, the Osprey has lost 20 airmen, 20 in the last 4 years. And yep. That needs to be fixed.
Absolutely. And it requires people who are dedicated, who are hardworking, who have integrity. And you know what? I'm pretty doggone sure that that's not a set of characteristics that are dominated by any demographic group. Okay, we need to go find that. But you know what? The percentage of blacks in the country happens to be 13%, And the DEI industry points out that the Navy only has 8% African-American officers. Well, okay. One of the authors of the book, Don't Give Up the Ship, is Phil Cullen. Phil did an excellent analysis, and he showed that 8% is actually an overperformance relative to the number of qualified candidates. And that's an issue. Well, wait a minute. Why are there so few qualified candidates incompatible with the demographics of the nation at large? And just this past week, Larry Elder wrote an op-ed piece where he looked at the schools in the K-12 schools in your august city of Chicago. And he pointed out that there are a depressing number of those schools in which not a single student was able to perform to grade level in math. Not one.
Yeah, no, I noted that in my newsletter from last week when the DNC was in town. I said, look, if you want to see Democrat policies in effect, first of all, Chicago's been run for about last 100 years, almost 100 years by Democrats only. And CPS is completely owned by the teachers union. And literally, a brisk mile and a half away walk is a school where 0% of the kids perform at math. Okay, hey, Captain Higgins, I'm going to put you on hold real quick. We're going to come back to you, and we're going to talk specifically about the book after this break that I have to do.
You're listening to The Real Story with your host,
George.
Jeannie Ives.
That bumper music. I want better bumper music.
Better bumper music?
Yeah, we got to get rid of that one.
All right, we're off next week.
Okay,
sort
next
of.
Week. Okay, all right, good.
But we'll get some.
All right, enough about that. Hey, we're back with Captain Higgins. Hey, Captain Higgins, let's get right to it because I want people to pick up this book. Don't Give Up the Ship. Woke politics are endangering our military and our nation. This book, it's really well laid out. It's very lengthy, and it's written by the Calvert Task Group. How about we just start with, tell us about the Calvert Task Group.
So the Calvert Task Group got started, strangely enough, by my friend and classmate Tom Burbage several years ago as just a bunch of guys from the Naval Academy playing golf on Saturday. And then they encountered an issue at the Academy and decided that it was time for them to do something bigger and better. And so it has grown to, we have now something over 400 members of the Calvert Group. And our mission is to educate the public on what's happening within the Navy, the Naval Academy, the Department of Defense, all the services with respect to the imposition of political agendas on the defense and national security of the United States. And so that's what we're doing. The book is written by 17 different authors. Each essay, while the book is a fairly hefty tome, the individual essays are easy to read and short, and they're very well done. Many of them are written by Tom. Brent Ramsey, whom you mentioned at the beginning of this spot, is an author of them. Phil Cullen, who's an excellent analyst, wrote some of them. So we have that, looking at that, and the idea is simply to lay the facts out Joe Friday style. Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And let people decide for themselves. We're not trying to indoctrinate anybody. We're simply laying out the facts and saying, every American that reads this needs to look at this, understand what we're saying, and then make a decision about how they want to engage in the arena and how they want to vote, ultimately. We're not endorsing candidates. We're not endorsing political parties. We're simply laying out the facts with respect to what's happening in the military.
Well, I mean, it is interesting. So, I mean, you guys aren't think tanks. Most of you guys don't have like a PhD after your name. Let's see, you don't have like multiple degrees. You're just a bunch of guys that served in the military, went on dangerous missions. What do you know about DEI? What do you know about officership? I mean, I guess my question is, how's your book being received by the officers you know on active duty? Do they whisper your support and otherwise stay silent? Are they happy that you put out these essays? And I mean, that's the problem here. We got too many people who think they have a bunch of degrees and can tell military folks exactly what's going on. That's the beauty of your book. It's written by the military for the military.
It is written for the military, but it's not just written for the military, although certainly we expect that to be part of the audience. But I think this is something that every American should understand. And the We don't engage in jargon. We don't engage in military language to the extent it becomes indecipherable. And so we're looking for Americans to read this book, read the essays, and say, how did we get here? What are we going to do? We need to think about what our responsibility as Americans is in this case, because this didn't happen. You asked DEI. I think one of the big questions we have to ask is, well, what the heck is DEI? Well, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, so I'm going to read you a quote that I think is just wonderful. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be the master? That's all. And what we're dealing with is we're dealing with a $15 billion global industry, the DEI industry, that uses those words to mean whatever it is they want them to mean at the moment. And that's not something that is useful. And in fact, DEI, by necessity, divides people. And whether you're in the military where unity is an absolute necessity, or whether you're in a company where unity is a powerful force, unity is important. If you break people into mutually exclusive groups, that just historically doesn't work well, whether it was the 30 Years' War or the Tutsis and Hutus in Rwanda,
That's
or
right.
the Shia and the Sunni.
That's right.
It doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So
Brent Ransby, writing in his particular essay on diversity, equity, inclusion, or shipmate, you can't have both, says emphasis on race and politics is a recipe for division and disunity, not the traits that lead to effective organizations. He's absolutely right. Now, the interesting about these essays, and there's quite a few of them, like you mentioned, they don't just talk about military stuff. Your particular one was on power. Now, we don't have much time left, but tell me more about why this was important to write about power, along with all these other things that talk about the danger to the military of woke policies.
So I think one of the things that we have to be very careful about is concentrations of power. And I read a news article maybe 25 or 35 years ago that talked about a specific foreign affairs issue and how that was taken on by a senator in the Senate rather than by the State Department. And the point of that essay was that at that time, power was distributed throughout the federal government. The Senate had power. Members of the House had power, members of the executive had power, and it's becoming more and more concentrated as we ask the federal government to do more and more things. And we need to be careful about that because the federal government or the government that can do things for you can also do things to you. And the brilliance of our founding fathers was to build a federal government in which power didn't concentrate. And in my essay, I quote from Frank Herbert, one of Frank Herbert's Dune novels, countering Lord Acton, saying power does not corrupt, but it does attract people who are corruptible. And I think that's important as we look at that. So we want to make sure that we don't allow concentrations of power to overwhelm and destroy the republic that we have had for the last 248 years and the freedoms and the rights that we've enjoyed. So that's what that's about.
Well, we've pretty much got to leave it right there. I want to thank you so much, Captain Higgins, for joining me tonight. It's a pleasure to be working with the Calvert Task Group. I'm part of the MacArthur Society, and we're trying to get something done, some attention brought to the fact that the military needs to be a meritocracy. I really appreciate you writing this book. Again, folks, you can order it on Amazon. Don't give up the ship. Woke policies are endangering the military and our nation. You can buy it. It'll be in publication September 17th. Captain Higgins, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you very much, Jeannie, and beat Army.